So today we're going to talk about k, ch, g, r, ng, k, ch, g, ye, nye. Now obviously that's quite a lot of sounds, but all of these sounds share features in common with each other, and once you understand how they relate to each other, it actually becomes quite simple, and there's quite an elegant system of spelling that allows us to tell how to pronounce these different sounds. So these diagrams, which might look a bit intimidating, are of the mouth. So the person in these diagrams is facing to the left, and on the left you can see the top teeth and the bottom teeth, and then going backwards on the roof of the mouth we have the alveolar ridge, which is a hard ridge behind the top teeth, the hard palate, which is the hard flat bit in the roof of your mouth, and then going further back it softens into the soft palate. So understanding the anatomy of the mouth really helps us pronounce these different sounds and these distinctions that we don't have in English. And then the big pink blob is the tongue. So we'll start in the top left. So when we're pronouncing broad sounds in this group, the tongue is touching or approaching the soft palate. So everything on the left on this chart is broad, and everything on the right is slender. So in the broad ones, we're involving the soft palate, and that's why these sounds are known as velar sounds, because the velum is another word for the soft palate. So the sounds at the top of the chart are what are called stops, and that's because the tongue is touching the roof of the mouth and it's stopping the airflow. So these sounds are stops. So on the left they're broad, and on top they're stops. So these are broad stops, or velar stops as they're known more broadly in linguistics. And the two velar stops we have in this set of sounds are k and g. And you'll notice that those are pretty similar to k and g that we have in English, but they are often pronounced slightly further back in the mouth, meaning the tongue is touching the roof of the mouth slightly further back than we would in English. And there's also the nasal ng, and that's pronounced similarly with the tongue in the same position. So to go through some examples, I'll start by comparing the broad stops and the slender stops. So if you look at the set of words at the top in the middle, we have broad gal versus slender gal. We have broad cal versus slender cal. We have broad og versus slender og. We have broad foscu versus slender foshku. And we have broad lung versus slender ling. And you'll note that in some cases these words differ in other ways as well, but these are the best pairs I could pick out. So when we're comparing these broad stops, these velar stops, to the slender sounds on the right, which are also known as palatal stops because the tongue is touching the hard palate, we notice, as I said, that in the broad sounds the tongue is much further back, and in the slender sounds the tongue is touching the roof of the mouth much further forward in the mouth, and further forward than we would generally have in English, in most dialects at least. So compare gal, which is a broad g, with slender gal, 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 broad, gal, slender. Call, broad. Cal, slender. Og, broad. Og, slender. Foscu, broad. Foscu, slender. Long, broad. Ling, slender. So I hope you can hear the difference there. So next we can compare the broad stops, which are in the top left, with the broad fricatives, which are in the bottom left. Now, what fricative means is that the airflow in the mouth is partially blocked, but not fully. So air still escapes through, and that's what makes the sound. So some examples of fricatives that we have in English would be f, sh, ch, hy, s. And some examples of fricatives we have in Irish would be f, f, v, ch, hy, r. And so these fricatives are pronounced fairly similarly to their counterpart stops. So you'll notice that the fricatives in the bottom left are the lenited forms of the stops in the top left. So for example, the stop gal is lenited to ral. And that's a pattern that's really worth noticing in Irish, because once you see these connections, you see that lenition or shevu is changing the type of consonant that is in a word in a very consistent way. And similarly, when a broad sound becomes slender or vice versa, the type of sound that it is changing in a very consistent way. So let's compare gal to ral, cal versus chal, cal versus chal, and loch versus loch. Similarly, we can compare the slender or palatal stops in the top right to the palatal or slender fricatives in the bottom right. So here again, the tongue, rather than touching the hard palate and blocking airflow as it is in the stops, is just approaching the hard palate and only partially restricting the airflow. So in the first example, we have gal, which becomes yal. And you notice here that slender GH or DH, instead of being a true fricative, gal, actually is only a glide. So the tongue is even further away from the hard palate, and it's not really blocking the air at all. So we have ya, yal, which is the same sound as it is produced by an English Y. So that's an exception to this rule. So gal becomes yal. And historically, it actually would have been the fricative ige. And you still hear this in some words. So when you have a slender G or D before N, R, or L, you actually will still hear this fricative. So for example, glan has a slender G at the start, and when we have lenition on that G before the L, it becomes the fricative. So one example is in the novel Wichid a Yilama, Wichid a Yilama. We can hear the fricative there in Ihile, Ihilama. So we can compare gal with yal, cal with hyal, and you'll note that that fricative is the same as the one in English in most dialects in the word human or hue or the name Hugh. So hyal, hyal, human, hyal, cal versus hyal. And then we have oig versus biai, and you'll notice there that this slender GH and a DH would sound the same is again this yes sound, so it's just bi rather than having a true fricative there. And then we can compare finally click with clich. Clich. Okay, so finally at the bottom we can compare the broad and slender fricatives. So we have ral and yal. We have chal and chal. And we have cloch and clich. And in this last example, you'll notice that the CH is a bit reduced, so it often just sounds like a h. And this is common between vowels or often at the end of words as well. Particularly the broad ch is often reduced to just a h. So you often hear things like aher. And we can compare that with aichere, which is often less reduced, but can also be reduced. So acher or acher and aichere. So finally, I'm going to say some words and you have to tell me if the sound in them is broad or slender and a stop or a fricative. So firstly, cal. Is the k in cal a stop or a fricative? And is it broad or slender? Cal. It's a broad stop, k. Okay, next we have chal. Is the ch in chal broad or slender? And is it a stop or a fricative? Chal. It's a slender fricative. Next, rau. Is the r in rau broad or slender and a stop or a fricative? Rau. It's a broad fricative. Next, fascu. Is the k in fascu broad or slender and a stop or a fricative? Fascu. It's a slender stop. And finally, because I feel I've left them out a bit of this video, is the ng in long a broad or slender nasal? Long ng. It's broad. And we can compare that with the slender ling nye versus long ng. Okay, thanks for listening.